Hi, everyone. Today we are going to talk about dead zones. So we'll get into what that is in just a little bit. But first, today's warm-up is it's a bit of a story. So this picture was taken in 2017 in the Gulf of Mexico. What do you think might have happened to these fish? Make your best guess. Um, so you'll find this warm-up. This is lesson 9 warm-up. It's in Google Classroom. Yeah, just make your best guess. There are no right and wrong answers. And I will tell you what happened to these fish, but I'll tell you much later. But for now, just give me your best guess. All right, so go ahead and pause the video to do that. And then once you're done, we can carry on. So today's agenda, we just did the warm-up, which was looking at the picture of fish and just guessing what might have happened. Next, we're going to introduce dead zones. And then we're going to investigate the causes of dead zones. And finally, we'll do our exit slip. So today's learning target, the focus question is, how is a dead zone formed? So that's the question we'll be thinking about today and trying to answer. And then our learning target is, I can explain how humans have affected dead zones. So after today, you'll be able to tell me how humans created or affected dead zones. All right, so dead zones. So last class, we talked about estuaries, which are where that's where fresh water from rivers meets salt water from oceans. And we talked about how estuaries are these really cool ecosystems because they have salt water, fresh water, and a mix of salt water and fresh water. They have just a very wide range of organisms that live there. And so that's all really great. That ecosystem diversity is really cool. But there are a few bad things that can happen in or near estuaries. So today we're going to talk about dead zones, which is one of those bad things that can happen. So a dead zone is an area in a body of water where the water at the bottom has little or no dissolved oxygen. So you guys know that all animals need oxygen to live. On land, we breathe to get our oxygen. In water, fish and other aquatic organisms, they use their gills to take the oxygen from the water. So water has really, 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 really tiny little bubbles of oxygen that the fish can get, that we cannot get. So if there's little or no dissolved oxygen at the bottom of the ocean, what do you think is going to happen? You're right, the fish will die. The fish that live there are going to die because very few organisms can survive in dead zones. So without oxygen, you can't really have life. So let's take a look at how dead zones are formed. So here we have a bit of a diagram that's going to help us understand this. At the top, you'll see we have fresh river water. So that's this brown stuff. This is water that's coming straight from the river. All this blue water is salt water. And these little white dots, those are oxygen bubbles. Real oxygen bubbles in water, much smaller than this. But this is just so that you can see them. And then we also have living organisms. So we have some shrimp, some fish. We've got some shelled organisms. We've got some plants. So what happens is river water carries nutrients into the ocean. Nutrients is red. We're going to define what kinds of nutrients later in these slides. But for right now, we'll just call them nutrients. So river water carries nutrients into the ocean. Then algae eat all the nutrients from the river water. So algae is a producer and it can grow extremely fast. If there are nutrients in the water, it'll grow because it grows very quickly and it eats them very quickly. So algae eat all the nutrients from the river water and they cause an algal bloom, which is where lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of algae all appear very quickly. and that'll turn the water green. So the water will turn green just like this. And algae don't live forever. So as the algae die, they fall to the bottom of the ocean. So as all of this green muck dies, it's going to fall to the ocean. And as the algae decomposes at the bottom of the ocean, they use up the oxygen in the water. So decomposers also need oxygen to survive, and decomposers actually use oxygen to break down dead bodies and waste. So bacteria, a lot of bacteria use oxygen to break down dead bodies and waste. So as they decompose all of this algae, they use up quite a bit of the oxygen in the water. So the next thing that happens is we find that, come on, all right. The next thing that happens is we find that as a result, the water at the bottom of the ocean loses most of its oxygen. And this is called a dead zone. So we can see there are no more oxygen bubbles in this diagram. And so then all of the life at the bottom of the ocean must move to a new home or they will die. So, the fish that are fast enough or that can move, they'll move to a new place. But for things that maybe swim kind of slowly, like these fish, I guess they swim slowly, or these plants or these shellfish, they can't move. And so when a dead zone happens, they just die. They can't go anywhere. So dead zones are capable of totally destroying an ecosystem very quickly too. So this is how the dead zone forms. These are just the 3 diagrams that we just looked at. And yeah, I recommend pausing the video and just taking a look at these again. But otherwise we'll carry on. So really quickly, by yourself, I want you to look at these boxes, and I want you to put these boxes in the correct order in which they happen. So this is how a dead zone forms. In what order does it happen? So just take these 5 letters and put them in order. So pause the video to do that. And so I hope you just put these in order because here are the answers. So first, nutrients enter the ocean. Second, algae eat all the nutrients. So algae appear, they bloom, and then they eat all the nutrients. Third, as the algae die, they fall to the bottom of the ocean. 4, as the algae decompose, the water at the bottom of the ocean loses oxygen. And 5, without any oxygen at the bottom of the ocean, all life must leave or they will die. Awesome. So what exactly causes dead zones? So we know that a dead zone happens when algae blooms, and as they die, they decompose, and as they decompose, they use up the oxygen. But we know that the algae appear because of the presence of nutrients in the water. What nutrients? Where do they come from? So one of the main causes of dead zones is fertilizer runoff. So dead zones happen when a large amount of nutrients is added to a body of water. So remember when we talked about runoff 2 or 3 classes ago, we talked about agricultural runoff. So that's when it rains on a field, the water picks up soil, fertilizer, manure, pesticides, and it carries all of that stuff to the nearest river. And so what happens is this water is going to pick up fertilizer and manure. Fertilizer and manure are sources of nitrogen, which is one of the nutrients that algae really love to eat. It's very difficult. Plants and other producers can't make their own nitrogen, so they have to get it from somewhere else. So if there's a lot of nitrogen in the water, algae is going to bloom. So anyway, this water is going to carry the fertilizer and the manure, sources of nitrogen, to the nearest river. In the United States, half of the United States and most of the Midwest is covered by the Mississippi River Basin. So this is basically all one watershed. And so we know that there's a lot of farming that happens in the Midwest. And those farmers use fertilizers and manure. And so when this runoff happens, it's going to carry that water into the nearest river. And that river might feed into a bigger river. And that bigger river might finally feed into the Mississippi River, which then goes down to the Gulf of Mexico. And that is how we get these gigantic dead zones. Gigantic. So I think this is, I always forget if this is Louisiana or Mississippi, but this is either Mississippi or Louisiana. And you can see this dead zone is all this red stuff, this red and this yellow. That is water where there's not enough oxygen for fish to live. And that's all because of the nitrogen that is coming down this river. Right? And this is a huge problem, not only for fish, because algal blooms lead to a lot of bacteria as well. And so anywhere there's an algal bloom, that water is not safe for us to come into contact with. So here you see a sign, this area is potentially unsafe for water contact. Avoid contact with visible surface scum. And that surface scum is all this green stuff. To me, it kind of looks like slime from like Nickelodeon, like the Nickelodeon TV channel. Yeah, and so when this happens is when we can get a dead zone. And we see this fish, it's dead, probably died because there's not enough oxygen in the water. And that is also what led us to this warm-up picture. All of these fish suddenly died because there was not enough oxygen in the water, because there's a dead zone here or nearby. So we now know that when river water carries nutrients into the ocean, by nutrients we really mean nitrogen. And those nutrients, that nitrogen is coming from fertilizer and manure, so poop. Right. But if you don't believe me, that's smart. It's good to be skeptical, especially in science. If you don't believe me, we're going to take a look at some graphs. And those graphs will hopefully prove to you that, that nitrogen is the cause for dead zones. So here we see a graph. The blue bars represent nitrogen, and the purple lines, those represent stream flow. So what do you notice about the nitrogen levels in stream flow? And this is in the Mississippi River Basin, so the Gulf of Mexico. What do you notice? All right, so you'll notice that when stream flow is up, nitrogen is also up. And when stream flow is down, nitrogen is also down. That's because stream flow, that measures how much water is coming through the Mississippi River, how much volume of water. And when it rains really hard, here, we're going to pick up a lot of nitrogen, but we're also going to have a lot of water. So the more water there is, it also makes sense that the more nitrogen there is that is arriving to the Mississippi River. More rain means more runoff, and both of those things mean more water. So, yeah, so nitrogen, so the higher the stream flow, probably the more nitrogen we're going to get in the Mississippi River. All right, and I also have a graph that shows you the size of dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. So these graphs are kind of ugly, and they're a little hard to read, but I tried to line them up by year. So you can see right here is 2013, so down here is also 2013. Here is 1989, right here is also 1989. So it's almost lined up. What similarities or what differences do you notice between these two graphs? What do you see? Okay, so there are a lot of things to see here. But first, the general gist of this is that when nitrogen is up, the size of the dead zone is probably also going to be up relative to the other years. And when the stream or when the nitrogen is down, the dead zone is also going to be kind of small compared to the years before and after it. So we see right here, this is not very much nitrogen. The dead zone's kind of small. Same here, this nitrogen's smaller than these two, so the dead zone's going to be smaller as well. Of course, that's not a perfect trend because we see here when nitrogen is relatively, when nitrogen's like medium, it's like medium, the size of the dead zone is quite big. And that doesn't quite match up with this medium part. You also see over here when the nitrogen is kind of high, the dead zone's kind of small. And that's because there are other factors that determine the size of dead zones too. For example, if it's really cloudy for 1 year, or if a year is really cloudy or it has lots of hurricanes, then the clouds are going to block out the sunlight. And if there's little sunlight, then algae can't grow as well. Algae is a producer; it needs sunlight. And then there's also, if there are a lot of waves, or if temperature of the water changes, then there will be more mixing of the water. And if there's more mixing, then it's harder for dead zones to form. But regardless, generally, the more nitrogen there is, the bigger the dead zone is going to be. And also, this is just for the Mississippi. This graph is only for the Mississippi River. There are other rivers that lead into the Gulf of Mexico, and they might be carrying runoff as well. So that's another thing that might explain these differences. Okay, but we know that nitrogen is a huge cause for dead zones. All right, so let's move on to the exit slip. The exit slip is in Google Classroom under week 6 called Lesson 9 Exit Slip. There are 3 questions to think about. First, what are the abiotic factors affected in a dead zone? How are they different from a normal ecosystem? So abiotic factors means non-living. So that would be things like, well, I won't tell you what things, this is your exit slip, but abiotic factors are non-living. So what are some non-living things affected? And how are they different from a normal ecosystem? Number 2, what are the biotic factors affected in a dead zone? So what are the living things that are affected by a dead zone? And how are they different from a normal ecosystem? Number 3, this one's going to ask you to think a little bit. But if the size of the Gulf of Mexico dead zone increases, how might fisheries be affected? So fisheries, that means like fishermen, so people who fish. If the dead zone increases, what might happen to those fishermen? How might their lives be changed? Right? If you have any questions, please leave a comment and I will get back to you. Yeah. But otherwise, I will see you in class next time. Bye.